Welcome again. How we doing? This is going to be part three of my top 12 records of each decade of my life. The series hasn't gone exactly as I wanted it. I was trying to keep it more simple, one album to demonstrate. But some of those groups like the Stones and the Beatles, some of those soul records, I felt like it was more important to show how broad a swath my collection, my interests quickly cut across some of those bands and some of those artists. The 20s was quite a crazy time for me, obviously. And from my roots in metal and psychedelia into the depths of classic rock with Dylan and Neil and the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin, into my new affection for soul music that comes via Sly Stone, that book which exposes me to even some jazz like Miles Davis. It just really starts to broaden all my interests as a collector. And one of the coolest things about my collection is the core of my collection comes to me in the 90s when vinyl was being discarded. So records that are selling for 30, 40, 60, $80 say, I was picking them up for 2, 3, $4, which was a pretty cool way to build up all my classic rock history, even a lot of the Motown, soul, Philly stuff. I mean, when I was buying that stuff in the 90s, early thousands, it was still a fraction of what that stuff's going for today. And as I start to dive into jazz in the late 90s, early 2000s is where it really starts to explode. The prices start to increase, but I still got most of my Blue Notes between '03 and '07. I'm still paying a fraction of what people are paying for some of that stuff now. I still find it interesting how a lot of people don't collect used vinyl. They're always looking for the just waiting for the new releases to come out. There's a lot of good used vinyl out there, people, and people often complain about new pressings, the imperfections, the little skips, hicks, things pressed incorrectly. That was never the issue in the 70s or the 80s or even the 60s. There was such a mass production of this stuff that it was punched out in such high numbers and high quality in terms of each piece being uniform. So you don't really have to worry about imperfect releasing or pressings. And a lot of those old records, especially once you get prior to Dynaflex, early 70s and 60s, 50s, those plates can take a lot of abuse because oftentimes the records are thick enough that the grooves are deep enough that all that surface stuff is quite imperceptible, especially if the music has any punch to it. If you have an Art Blakey Jazz Messenger record with some surface scuffing, that band hits so hard that once they're rolling, that little crackle of the fireplace won't even be perceptible until the quiet between songs. But you're like, oh, man, that record does have some scuffs on it. It just doesn't matter when the music's playing. And there's just so much cool stuff out there still to be had. I'm collecting a few small labels right now still, and my collecting's kind of piecemeal right now. I'm so busy and my money's tied up, so I haven't been able to really invest in much vinyl as of the last few months. But there's a few small labels that I have been kind of trying to extract the pieces for, like Dizzy Gillespie had a label called DG. And I know some of it ends up at Savoy, if not most of it, but there's a cool Shelly Manne, there's a cool Milt Jackson, which I actually have on the way, a couple of Dizzy Gillespie records, which those are both on the way as well. There's two other labels, one's Esoteric, which I talked about last month, had those two on the air, off the air records, 1 and 2. There's a cool Charlie Christian that's coming, which I'll show you when I get it. Another Dizzy Gillespie piece. Dizzy has some interesting stuff in the early 50s, and because of the focus on collectors, a lot of it kind of goes under the radar. His early work at some of these smaller labels is quite fantastic and kind of ahead of the curve, which isn't always the case for Dizzy when he's recording in the 60s, sadly, but Dizzy's always such a great player that any setting, he's still going to throw some fire out at you. You know, it's just how Dizzy operates. So, I was drywalling yesterday, and, buzzing out the holes. Again, my sinuses. I think this is the last real dirty job. We're going to start sealing this thing up, taping and mudding it today, myself, And then we put the tiling on the floor down, put the fiberglass on the wall. And then I think the plumbers and electricians come back and do their finishing touches. We install the gear and we get our final permits, and hopefully we're actually getting light at the end of the tunnel here. But it's been very, very busy. I wanted to make this episode 2 days ago, but I had plumbers in here drilling holes for mop sinks. Being an old building, the plumbers had their share of challenges they had to face. So these lists are tough to do, and like I said, I wanted to make them more finite, but especially that 20s episode just sprawled because my music interest sprawled. And I didn't want the perception to be that I got into Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder and not R&B as a whole, because there's such a wide musicology of R&B that stretches from a lot of different styles and sounds. And same with the hip-hop. A lot of jazz people deny hip-hop as having any relevance or importance, but I need to drive this point home to you. Inner city schools had their funding cut repeatedly into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. And one of the first things to get slashed always was music programs. And in New York and Harlem, in the Bronx, in New Jersey and the Bricks, in parts of Long Island and Brooklyn, parts of Queens, those music programs were the first to go in the inner cities. And so we took their instruments away from them, and they started using their dad's turntable to make their own music. And their emceeing became their improvisation. I mean, it's jazz without the instruments. They were taken from them. We don't have trumpets at our access and our fingertips anymore. We're not giving guitars and basses and drums to play. And so I'll take my dad's turntable here. I'll loop that back and forth, back and forth. Let me throw it around. 1, 2, 1, we go. And that it just became a thing. But it's that same necessary need to evoke and emit what's on my mind and on my chest and on my spirit and on my soul that Coltrane emanates whenever he puts that horn to his lips. And if you can't hear that same consciousness and that same spirituality coming from that same experience as being a black man in America, I don't think you're really hearing jazz. So to dismiss rap as being irrelevant, or having no value, I mean, you don't have to like it. But my point is the message is the same. And that kind of gamut, it runs from parting to forget my troubles to directly facing my troubles and addressing them, that exists in hip-hop, exists in jazz. And if you don't like what hip-hop MCs have to say, if Dead Prez makes you feel uncomfortable, if Chuck D makes you a little nervous and KRS-One makes you want to call the police, that Blue Note hard bop, I mean, that stuff's as militant and as angry and as socially conscious and political and as invested in its surroundings and overcoming its demons as any music that's ever been made. That's why it's so potent. It's not the famous quality of the names there, because the names were fairly obscure at the time and they've become popular in our mindset, but they're not big names in jazz in the late 50s and early 60s by any means. Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Art Blakey, Horace Silver, these were under the cover names. The big names were all, like I said, at Verve. Impulse comes along and signs a lot of the big names. Columbia had taken the biggest names. Blue Note was an afterthought, a small slice of resistance and rebellion and tangible, focused energy rising up against its oppressor that, I mean, it's got might. And the fact that they had the rehearsal times, which meant they could actually communicate, have lunches and breaks together, smoke cigarettes, and talk about the news and the climate and what was happening politically and socially in America. You go back and you do take 3, suddenly there's a synergy because our spiritualities are linked. Our consciences are linked, and we're all thinking about Selma. We're all thinking about the riots in Detroit. And now it's easy for us to all be focused and play with some synergy and some magic. It's not hard for it to happen. Crowds of people become riotous from the unity of a powerful force. And the force of resistance against tyranny and against resistance, not allowing change to happen, that's an easy thing for a group of people to sign up for. So I think it's important, if you want to hear what MCs are saying, it's a great way to get some introspection into what jazz players are saying. And there's a big difference between what a guy like Harry Sweets Edison is emoting versus a guy like Lee Morgan on the same instrument. There's a big difference between what Miles Davis is emoting on the trumpet and Chet Baker. Their personal experiences, their life stories, their economic backgrounds, their drug addictions, their friends and family, their relationships, all of that comes to the fore to express who a guy is and how he wants to handle all that conflict. And so hip-hop and jazz are very interrelated. And a lot of the early native tongue, late 80s, early 90s hip-hop borrows and samples a lot from jazz, not just from CTI, but from earlier sources as well. I mean, jazz and R&B do blend in together. A lot of those instrumental jazz R&B crossover records were filled with great little instrumental breaks that were easy to take and sample and rhyme over, because most of the R&B of the day has lyrics that makes those breaks a little tougher to snip out. So a lot of that jazz stuff gets sampled a bunch. Ron Carter was playing with Tribe Called Quest. Like, the fabric isn't separated. And what stitches between them is that soul funk era that was embodying a lot of that same principle of, first, it's going to be very much a party music. Dancing has always been at the core of the black culture. But all these genres of black music evolve into a more potent, socially conscious effort towards the end of their arc. Sometimes even after the popularity has waned and a new sound has come along that's taken the dancing and the audiences away, what's left of that genre, whether it be jazz or hip-hop or soul and funk, those remaining artists who stay there suddenly go, well, it's not about selling records anymore, it's about saying what I always really wanted to say. So there's a potency and an honesty that comes through this music that's tangible and is very important. And so it's why I let my hip-hop and my 20s and my R&B soul record thing kind of expand, because I wanted to cover that variation, because I think it relates to jazz a lot. And it helped me hear jazz. It helped me understand jazz. And nothing helped me understand jazz more than DJing in the black community for 10, 15 years and getting to know the black community and how they talked and how they hung out, what they had to say, how they wanted to converse on a Friday night and what they wanted to speak about. Most of them didn't want to speak about racism on a Friday night. They wanted to have a good time. They wanted to kind of put that on the back burner right now. We know it's there, but we don't need to address it all the time. It was a pretty cool time for me, that interaction, that growth, that as a white boy from Canada playing, Frankie Beverly and Mays for 300 Black Folk, it was spiritual. It was incredible. I felt very honored, and we're bringing in a lot of the urban white folk at that time, and there was kind of an integration happening that I was proud of. I was proud of that. We're playing this old music. People are well behaved and dressed well because it's good old school music from the 50s and the 60s and the 80s. And so people were behaving because they're grown-ups, which allowed the white folks to kind of come and intermingle. And there's friendships today that I see on Facebook all the time that were rooted in those nights, that are interracial friendships. And also a lot of people got married, coming down, hooking up at those gigs. And I DJed some of their weddings, So it's a pretty special time in my life. But it definitely helped me hear jazz. I was like, well, there's no way that this music can be that separate in message from everything that's come after it. All civil rights did was give the microphone an opening and put the saxophone in the back burner, which is exactly what happened. So moving into my 30s, that's a nice little opening monologue there. Again, my experiences are broader. My amount of time listening to any one record is diminishing because my collection keeps growing. So records I was obsessed with in my teens and 20s, I listened to thousands of times. Now, by my 30s and my 40s, if I listen to a record a lot for a few months, it's a couple hundred times maybe. And some of these records I probably listened to 30, 40 times, and that's equivalent today to something that, and there's a few records in the next 2 decades here that I listen to in my car a lot. Me and the wife both loved it, so we drive around listening to it. And so that's where some of this stuff comes in. But let me jump off right the bat here with a record I still hold dear. It's from 2002. I've talked about it once or twice before. It's the fantastic Blue Six, A Beautiful Tomorrow. Jay Dennis is the brains behind it. Dave Boonshoft is the bass player who plays kind of bass for this label. Some of these smaller dance labels are a bit like the jazz labels, where they had studio bass players, studio horn players, and they would perform on a lot of people's records on the label. And Dave Boonshoft plays bass on a lot of these Naked Music records. And Naked Music has probably 5 or 6, 7 full lengths, maybe more, and probably 30 EPs with great covers, beautiful drawings and artwork. It really sucked me in. It's really organic, melodic, deep house. It's got some real urban R&B aspects to it, mixed in with nice, deep, mid-tempo, never too diva-esque, never too nightclubby. I mean, some of the remixes get more nightclubby, but the albums have a melancholy and a beauty and an arrangement and a vocal quality. The vocals are immaculate. I think Lisa Shaw might sing on some of these. But everything on Naked Music I love dearly, but this record has really never fallen out of my circulation. I can play it in the car anytime, sing every word to it. Most of the songs do have words, more of a song structure to them. Beautiful Tomorrow, Blue Six, 20 years old, and it's still, to me, one of the great records. And it's a measuring stick for me when it comes to production. And the production that ended up in disco ends up in house music and techno music in the 80s and 90s. The producers were very precise. And some of these great deep house records from this era, Ohm from San Francisco was another label I liked a lot. Buzz and Fly, Ben Watt out of England, who was from Everything But the Girl. There's a lot of different genres of house and techno I got into. I had a lot of friends who were DJs doing this style of music. I was more doing the hip-hop R&B stuff, but I still fell in love with some of the stuff, and this record is outstanding. Next record I want to share with you is Thievery Corp, The Richest Man in Babylon. Beautiful 4-record set of a 1 CD album, but they put it on 4 records. It's beautiful artwork and photographs inside. And there's a obvious edge here to these photographs. And there's a political charge to everything Thievery Corp speaks about. And it's very socially conscious. Elements of reggae. They borrow a lot from black music. They're 2 white cats from DC, actually. And they have their own little club in DC, which I'd love to go to someday. But I love everything Thievery Corp did. This is also from like 2001, maybe 2002. Can't remember exactly. But The Mirror Conspiracy before this is also outstanding. A lot of the records after this, like Cosmic Game, was outstanding. And then I'm probably showing you this record one time before, but this is one that they did probably 2-3 years ago now. It's kind of a reggae record with a lot of Jamaican reggae dance hall stars and but socially conscious lyrics, man. It's hard stuff. It's Strike the Root, The Ghetto Matrix, The True Sons of Zion, Letter to the Editor, Time and Space. It's outstanding. Let the Chalice Burn. I've listened to this record a lot. It's one of those ones I put on a CD in the car, and I can just play it for days. And again, this is a fairly current one, but Thievery Corp is definitely on my list. I listen to them a lot. Just great down-tempo, loungy, organic stuff. And Thievery Corp was something that, during the great down-tempo lounge movement of the early 2000s, you would have heard them everywhere when you walked into something. Saint Germain, if you heard Saint Germain, you were going to hear some Thievery Corp coming up next. And I love Saint Germain a lot too, but I just talked about them a few episodes ago. Thievery Corp is definitely, and it's organic. It's like not just all samples and loops. There's some of that, but there's a lot of real musicians playing, a lot of percussion and world sounds. And if you go see them live, they have a live working band that's toured with them for a long time. And actually one of the members has kind of stopped touring, but the band is still touring, and one of the members is still leading the band, and they sound outstanding with all their tablas and their. It's fantastic stuff. Watch them on YouTube. If record kicks the butt. Welcome to Jam Rock. Bob had a lot of kids. You know, Steven, Ziggy, Damien, Kalana. There's so many. So I think it's like 12, 15 kids he's had. He's got a kid, I think maybe a grandkid now, Skip Marley. He's got some great stuff out. Really into that stuff. But Damien Marley's Welcome to Jam Rock. Again, probably 05, 04, when I was DJing a lot in the city. This record came out, and out in the streets they call it murder, which was sampled from an older something Beagle record, Super Beagle I think it was, which when I found that original I was like, oh wow, that's where they got that from. But just a great record. Nas shows up on this on a couple tracks, The Road to Zion. Well, of course they made a record together a few years later that's really strong, conscious music as well. But the Jam Rock is incredible. There for You is a song I've played as a DJ 1,000 times. The Master Has Come Back, killer. All Night's beautiful. Stephen Marley, beautiful with Bobby Brown. He does Pimp's Paradise. Hey Girl with Stephen Marley. It's really an outstanding record from front to back. And I beat the shit out of it, played the crap out of it. You can't get enough of it. And if you like music that has a message and has a militancy, but it's under control. It's not just wild aggression. It's not anarchy. It's militancy with focus, you know. And that's an important variation to delineate. So, another band I got into right about this time, and this is probably the last rock record that's going to make an appearance on my list. And I really wasn't listening to rock and roll by the time 03, 02 comes along. I was pretty much into, classic rock put my hard rock to sleep, you know, and I would listen once in a while for nostalgia, but I wasn't really listening to hard rock at all. By now I was listening to reggae and soul and diving into jazz and blues, and all this stuff was happening. And very few rock records had any kind of interest to me. I heard the first Korn record. I liked it, but I wasn't going to say, like, it's not one of my favorite records. I mean, it's kind of ignorant and angry for unfocused reasons. Slipknot, that first record was like, okay, that's the next level from Pantera right there. And I listened to it quite a bit, but it was System of a Down. I saw a video for, not Toxicity, for Chop Suey. And it just stood out to me against what was happening in the rest of the sounds on MTV at the time and the video channels. There was a kind of an integrity and an anger and a focus and even that first song, Chop Suey, I was like, I couldn't really tell what the message was. I'm like, is this Christian contemporary? What's going on here? Angels, suicide, all this stuff happening. But as I dove in deeper and I found out their Armenian roots, living in South Central Los Angeles, where there's a huge Armenian population. And again, it's got that socially conscious music of a people who've lived in oppression. And if you don't know about the history of the Armenians with the Turkish genocide and the big population that escaped and lives in America now and kind of supports what's left in Armenia back home. And Armenia is having better times, but it's always in conflict with Azerbaijan. There's the old Soviet Union on the doorstep. Russia's right there. There's the Republic of Ossetia and all these things happening in that region. So the Caucasus is always kind of a highly fueled region of the world, which gives Serge Tankian, who I think lived in Beirut for a while, which is also a military hotbed of chaos and bombs exploding and political inequality. And you get to hear both sides of the story in a place like Beirut. So the singer Serge Tankian has this knowledge and this first-hand experience that makes his lyrics and his delivery super powerful. And it's probably the last rock band that really, really sucked me in. Big fan. They made 2 more records after this. This was a two record set, color vinyl, of System of a Down Steal This Album, which was kind of outtakes from this. But it was fun stuff, and there's a lot of different roots in here, from ska and punk to heavy metal and thrash to hip hop. There's a lot of different influences in System of a Down, and on top of that, they're putting a little bit of a mid-eastern twang in the melodies at time. Darren Malakian, the guitar player, has these great melodic lines that just suck you in, and he also sings a great harmony to surge at times. And sometimes when you add a vocal harmony to almost any music, it gives it a depth that you can really feel a soul, if you will. Whether it's Brent Midland back in the day, like I said in the last episode, or even Keith Richards, some of his backups to Mick are make your hair stand up on end. And even Bon Jovi, who, Bon Jovi's campy 80s rock. It's Richie Sambora's backing harmonies that makes so many of those choruses and bridges so hooky and memorable. They stick in you because when he adds that third or that fifth or that seventh or whatever it is, it just makes your hair stand. And it makes most of the other bands at the time who might have had, some of those singers sang their own harmonies, but to have another person echoing your voice and it's next level. I've always loved that. And the System of a Down does that well. The next artist I want to talk to you about is Brian Eno. I want to go through this rather rapidly, but Eno again has a big catalog of stuff that I got into a lot. Probably 2002, 3, 4 in there. Editions EG. I think I talked about Orb on the last episode, Dr. Alex Patterson. It was editions and stuff that he was putting out, Brian Eno, in the mid-'70s that were, it deconstructs music, some of it. And he first was a member of Roxy Music, and Roxy Music is all right, kind of glam pop, alternative stuff that I have a few records by, and I was never super into him. Eno goes his own way, and he's since become one of the most important producers in rock and pop. He's produced a lot of legendary records from David Bowie in the 70s to U2's classic records in the 80s and 90s. I mean, Eno is a pretty prolific personality in especially the British music scene. But his own work was interesting. And he starts off with some kind of poppy efforts, which I'll just skim through here. This is No Pussyfooting with Robert Fripp. King Crimson, I believe, if I remember right. Cool cover. And it gives you some idea where he's going to go. Here Comes the Warm Jets. Again, there's some vocals on this. I'm not a big fan of his voice. Taking Tiger Mountain by Storm. And then it was the next effort, which I think is Another Green World. Yep. That he delves into some kind of ambient soundscape stuff. And Another Green World on here, In Dark Trees, I think it's called. It's one of those songs like, whoa. And it makes a lot of ambient compilations. If you ever know those new age ambient compilations, that song will often mix in there because it's kind of a precursor and a door opener to a lot of new things. And the line between new age and downtempo and world music and ambient music, it's a finely drawn pencil thin line. And one thing that can be campy and awful, the next thing can be just earthy and spiritual and be guidance music. So it's a tough thing to discern. Evening Star again with Robert Fripp and Eno. Brian Eno, Discreet Music. And this is where he starts really delving into, this is 801, more of a live, kind of more band record. Before and After Science, Brian Eno. And now this is where the real train starts happening, Music for Films. And Music for Films was straight on ambient minimalism. He deconstructs music, takes some of the composure and arrangement out of it, and makes it almost like a machine thinking. And it has these small ebbs and flows of sound. Aphex Twin really delves into it on their Ambient 1 and 2 collections. Fantastic, really great atmospheric music. And when it's done well, it's wonderful background music to explore the cosmos. Even the cosmos of my inner mind. When it's done poorly, I feel like I'm in a hair salon waiting for a massage. So it's a fine line, and Eno really kind of makes the line. And I love these records. Music for Airports, Ambient 1. Ambient 2, The Plateau of Mirror with the great Harold Budd, who's a piano player, and he plays these beautiful melancholic chords, slow, gradual shifts, and even a little melody with his ambient stuff in the background. Harold Budd's fantastic. Ambient 3, The Days of Radiance. This is with a guy by the name of Laraji, and Laraji plays like a zither, like a Same thing that Lisa Gerard from Dead Can Dance plays. I can't think what it's called right now, but it's got that interesting, almost koto-like sound. Ambient Land, on Land, Brian Eno, Ambient 4, another fantastic one. I listen to just tons. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts is probably the album I'm actually featuring here. This is with David Byrne from Talking Heads, and this record it's a kind of a life-changing record. It has a lot of great loops and samples, along with some real organic instrumentation. It's got Byrne's quirkiness and Eno's spookiness, and man, Mea Culpa's fantastic. I love this whole record, I'm not gonna lie. Quran's fantastic. It's the Muslim prayers happening in the background parts of it. America's Waiting. Mea Culpa, yeah, it's hard to read right now. My eyes are great. Help Me Somebody's fantastic. Great record, real innovative stuff, and it's a real precursor to a lot of the electronic music that's to come. That's a door opener for the music industry as a whole. Apollo Atmospheres and Soundtracks. NASA hired Eno to make the background music to the footage of the moon. Okay, so that's where Eno's at. Harold Budd, Pavilion of Dreams. Again, that cover. This is a record I played endlessly at times. Meditative, hanging out, smoking some weed, chilling. This record would just be like meditative for me. Loved it. Harold Budd's fantastic. I know more Harold Budd, Brian Eno. More Harold Budd. I think Eno produces most of these. Harold Budd again. And you'll find these records sometimes in dollar bins. If the guy doesn't know, John Hossel, Fourth World's Possible Music Volume 1. Fourth World Music, Possible Music. Again, a great satellite shot of some river system. Maybe it's the Nile, I'm not sure. But this record is insanely cool. I think he shows up on one of those ambient 1, 2, 3s. I think he's on 2 or 3. Not 3. 3 was Laraji. But he's a trumpet player. But him and Eno put this sound on the trumpet. He gets this yearning of like a death crane. I mean, it's a black swan sound. And the swamp is just oozing this melancholic, filtered trumpet sound. Think of Miles Mute, but then it had some not stringy, but like it's a cool sound that they create, and it's something that Alex Patterson from the Orb samples a lot. Is some of the Hossel trumpet bits. More John Hossel, Vernal Equinox. This is also fantastic. Dream Theory, Hossel. And so this music was interesting, and like I said, it kind of deconstructs melody and music, and it kind of is almost like a palate cleaner. It's a bit like a cracker at a wine tasting. You put on some ambient stuff for a couple hours, and you can almost restart anywhere on the board and be like, oh, melody, beat, groove. It kind of will almost help you appreciate some of those foundational pieces of music again. And like I said, I love those records just for the ambience and the atmosphere that they can create. They're a little planetarium at times, and they're not very conducive to entertaining or having people conversing over, because they need to be kind of absorbed. But you can sit there and just a cup of coffee, and yeah, it's good stuff. So now jazz was creeping in. It was creeping in throughout this whole time in my 30s. And I'm just going to show you some records that were very impactful to me. And my relationship with jazz records is not quite the same as it is with R&B pop records. I can pull a jazz record out, and I can sometimes play it each side 3 times, just to kind of really connect with it and wait for that moment where I'm like, oh, I mean, it depends on what I'm doing, what's going on, but it can really be, and I might not pull it out for months or years even, but these are records that had heavy play. And I gotta say, I just dropped by to say hello, who I came to Johnny Hartman through John Coltrane, of course. Their record together is outstanding. That version of Lush Life to me is one of the coolest songs on the planet. But this version here, I just dropped by to say hello, which Sinatra does, other people do it. Illinois Jacquette is on some of the most beautiful breathy saxophone you'll ever hear on this. This record's killer. and it's like champagne bubbly fireside music. And I used to play it at closing of some of my gigs because it's just got that sweltering warmth of swanky, atmospheric, urban loveliness. It's fantastic. I love every song on this record. I like his other records as well, but this record really is the cream of the crop. And it's a record I still go to. I still listen to it. And I've easily listened to this record as much as any jazz record I own. Highly recommend that. A record, one of the first ones I found that was an old, making me fall in love with old jazz records, was this Red Garland 86. It's his second record as his leader. He's kind of just left. He's still worth miles, I think, at this point. He is. Great trio stuff with Chambers and Art Taylor. I'm on record for having said I love Red Garland's trio work pretty much always, regardless of his sidemen, even though it's usually Chambers and Taylor or Philly Joe. But great cover with that single monochromatic color scheme with the piano's innards. Beautiful, melancholic. I love Red. A record I've listened to 1,000 times. Clifford Brown. I came to Clifford pretty early. Partly because of the jazz documentary Ken Burns taught me. But there's something about his sound and his tonality. And I think even me saying I want to be one of the people who knows. So I love Clifford from the early get-go. Brown and Roach Incorporated. It's just a splash of life and energy. Number 36,008. So it's the 8th LP released by Emercy. Although this did have a prior 10-inch release in like 53 or 4. Clifford Maddox, Morrow, Landon Powell, the Standard Quintet, Ghost of a Chance, Sweet Clifford, Darn That Dream, Savoy. I'll string along. It's so fantastic stuff. And Clifford Brown's as beautiful of a butterfly balladeer as he is as the taking off of a fighter jet. I mean, Clifford has this wide range of tonality, and he's just so dexterous and comfortable at any tempo, in any setting, in any rhythm. There's really no one to match Clifford Brown on any instrument, and that probably even includes Charlie Parker. And I wish we had more better sounding Parker, which people often ask, what's the best sounding Parker? And the best sounding stuff is kind of in the later in his years where he's kind of abandoned bebop a little bit. He's just doing stuff for Norman Granz that might sell with strings, and, he was in poor shape. These two records were thunder and lightning for me. And I had, of course, earlier versions of these initially. I mean, the second covers, which I also, they're great covers as well. But I figured I'd show you the first initial covers here. 1522, 1521. Again, Clifford Brown steals the show. Clifford Brown's dynamic, explosive virtuosity, with Lou Donaldson being a younger, fiery alto player, channeling a lot of Parker. Just Blakey's thunderous backgrounds. Is it still Horace Silver on this? I think it is. Yeah, and Curly Russell's on the bass. So it's just an incredible quintet, brimming with energy and pulse and life. And it was records like that when you listen to them a couple, 3 times, all of a sudden you can just take in that aggression and that tenacity and that grit and that unwillingness to surrender. I mean, and then you put the Black Experience over top of that, and you're like, whoa, this has to be talking about some pretty heavy stuff from these guys' hearts. They're just pouring into their soul the complications of my day. These are records that were shaping me. Sketches of Spain. Maybe it's a big cliche, and it was also a bit of a misdirection for me. I love this record. It's beautiful. It's melancholic. It's atmospheric. It's got some world sound to it. Even a bit of new age sound at times. Gil Evans, the arranger, doesn't shy away from new agey sounds and world music. And of course, they're borrowing from a great Spanish composition that the name of I can't think right now. But it's a beautiful piece. However, it was misleading because it was one of the first jazz records I really dove into in the late 90s. it kind of broadened in my mind what the definition of jazz was. And it doesn't really come with that asterisk that says, this is jazz light or jazz fused with other things. And so you come away from Porgy and Bess and you come away from Sketches of Spain kind of thinking, man, what's the difference between classical music and jazz music? And it actually made it harder in my ears to define what's jazz and what's not. And this record blurs those lines so much that it actually was confusing for me trying to define what jazz is and how it sounds and what it looks like. And this record's pretty far from the blues. It's pretty far from hard swing. It swings a little bit at times, but it's disconnected from its dance roots. It's taken on world sound and classical sounds and melding and dovetailing things together. And it does it really well. So this is not a critique as much as it was just how it illuminated me and broadened my understanding to the point where I had to kind of refocus and understand, okay, not everything is jazz because the jazz player is playing a horn on it. Still a great record. And still a record I listen to fairly frequently. You know, I do find some of the Gil Evans stuff a little abrasive. Those high, dry, making me thirsty sounds and some of those, it's piercing, some of it, and much worse on digital. You know, just like Bitches Brew, on digital, it's unlistenable to me. At Ease with Coleman Hawkins, again, a record, number 1904 in my collection. I used to label everything with the year it came out and what number it was on my collection. And I haven't done it for the last probably 4,000 records, but I did it up to about 10,000 records. But 1904 gives me some chronology, gives me some idea of where I bought this. So this is probably late 90s. My first 500 records were pretty much classic rock. My next 400 were kind of soul, R&B, springing into jazz and hip hop. And then now 13,000 records later, I have over 14,000 records. And jazz is probably my biggest thing now with probably 6,000 jazz records. But this is a jazz record I got really early on. There's an alternate cover to this from the Moodsville sequence, number 7. But it's just one of my favorite records. I used to play it at gigs all the time. At Dawning, it's just gorgeous. And it's one of those records that I think we all kind of look for in our minds when we hear jazz and think of what jazz is. And that's it. Lastly, it's 2 Blue Notes. You know, Idle Moments, which is probably one of my favorites, top 10 songs in the world, and Sonny's Crib, which is one of the most militant, focused, and Sonny Clark is just, to me, one of the most important people at Blue Note. I've talked about both these records a lot, so I'm not going to dive too deep into either of them right now. But Idle Moments, the blues, that song is 14 minutes of bliss. Every soloist is just on point, pouring their heart into that song. And it's just melancholic and gorgeous and elegant. And Duke Pearson's piano playing is just the dream state, you know. And it's music like that kind of makes you once in a while go, oh, weren't these people supposed to be second-class citizens, less educated, unable to make this type of high, beautiful, elegant, delicate art? And it just proves their humanity. It proves their equality. In some ways, it surpasses its oppressor because it's so beautiful in spite of its tyranny. And then Sonny's Crib is kind of the other side of that coin, where it's just a fury of focused adrenaline and focused intelligence and resistance to this occupation, you know. And so those records were all huge shapers on my 30s and propelled me into the next decade where jazz really starts taking over. And there's a few things that still creep in from other genres, and we'll cover that in the next episode. And then I got a couple fun ideas for episodes along with hidden classics, which we're going to keep doing that. I think that's a fun thing I'm going to do. But I have this cool idea for when someone sits and listens to a song, what's it called? Reacts. I think I might do some reacting episodes where I listen to a song with you and react to it and talk about it live as I'm listening to it. I probably won't be able to monetize any of those episodes, but I think they might be popular and might bring people to the channel. And I don't really make a ton of money off monetization anyway, so I'll see how that goes and what kind of issues I run into. I am pretty sure I won't be able to monetize them, which, again, it's not that big a deterrent to me at this point. But anyway, I appreciate you all. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. We try to talk about the music and only the music here as much as possible. I had someone tell me that they hadn't watched the channel for a while because they didn't think I was still talking about music. I'm like, what else do I talk about besides music? And even my history and politics and social stuff all kind of ties into the music. So I don't really think I spend a whole lot of time or episodes or 6 months of episodes talking about something else. Again, that's my perspective, and I asked him what he was referring to, but he hasn't responded. But again, the music is all that really matters, and we want to do honor to these great players, and not just to. We don't want to just honor the people who are reissuing this stuff today, and those guys are great. We appreciate what they're doing, absolutely. But let's not forget to honor the men and women who made this music and what it stands for. That's the most important part of the art, and it's what the artists would want most from us as listeners, is to try to get into their headspace and be like, well, what was he trying to tell us? If we're not doing that with art, whether it's a painting, whether it's a play, whether it's a television show, movie, whether it's music, if you're not trying to figure out where is this coming from, what's this angle, what's it trying to say to me, I think we're living in a world free of philosophy at that point. And meaning and purpose has kind of been the whole point of my existence. I want to try to understand the best I can why I'm here. You know, it's not just about following the rules of my society. The opposite of society is the reality of everything that's ever been. And that's empowering. It says I don't have to live by the rules society lays out for me. Reality is all things. And so what are all of our cultures throughout history trying to accomplish? And obviously understanding is one of those principles. Society and civilization stands on the arts and understandings of philosophy. And of course, irrigation is the big one. But so it's interesting stuff. I hope y'all appreciate that. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.